Okay. All right. So day three, I'm going into digging a little bit more into the belief system and uncovering some of these rules and stories that we might be living by, and that might be just keeping us stuck. And this is really going to apply to any area of life and cross contextualize. I'm using, like I said before, using money as like the framework so we can really substitute some of these ideas with other topics, but this will give us an idea of how to get a little bit deeper into how our mind works and then what we need to do to start creating that change. So I use this one image because images really stimulate some type of response internally. And so I use this particular image to see if it stirs up some type of thoughts or maybe emotions, something that might be stored inside our thought process that we may or may not be aware of. So when you see this image, whatever comes to mind, if you wouldn't mind either putting it in the chat or just, making a mental note. And I apologize, I actually forgot to put the chat up, so let me see if I can get it just in case. I'm going to move this to my other screen. Okay. So does anything come up for you when you see this image? Anything either positive or negative or emotions? What do you notice? I gotta adjust my monitor. Yeah, dreaming of having more money. Yeah, so when you think about that and him dreaming about having more money, is there anything negative or positive that comes up with that? I know that I've done this with myself, and it's very interesting to see what comes up. Yeah, happy with what you have. I love that. So So there's different images that we can use. So it sounds like this is really like invoking some positive emotions and experiences within you, which is amazing. That's awesome. And sometimes what can happen is we can start to notice maybe some negative thoughts or maybe thinking about, oh gosh, maybe that guy's thinking too much about money. Maybe he is focusing on it too much, or maybe I'm feeling bad about myself because I don't have enough. So there's lots of different thoughts that may come up either with this image or other images that we might be um, thinking about. So this can be a great way to kind of prompt some journal exercises and really getting into what is really going on there that might be keeping me stuck. Okay, so the one other thing that I like to do for journaling and helping to understand what the thought process is when it comes to money or any other area of life, if we write down any thoughts, and this is kind of tied to what that picture might have invoked, is writing down any thoughts that might come up, and positive or negative, they're all welcome. If there's anything in particular, when you think about rich or wealthy people, whatever that might be, just notice if anything comes up and if you want to jot it down or just make a mental note, whatever's easier. And you can always dig into this later too. And let me know if you have anything that comes up when you do this. Yeah, that's an interesting thought. Rich people don't think about money, they're content overall. I really like that. And it's quite interesting when you get to talk to different people and get their experiences and thought processes. There's such a wide variety of thoughts and beliefs around the rich and wealthy. And I know a very, very long time ago, I was thinking about I always looked at rich and wealthy people as being very intelligent, really smart, having all of these skills and abilities that I didn't see myself as having. So some people can write out a lot of negative thoughts come up about rich and wealthy people. Maybe that they're snobby. I've heard that. Maybe that they have other negative qualities and characteristics. And so for me, it was kind of the opposite situation where I tended to put rich and wealthy people above me on some type of ladder, some mental ladder, where I felt like they had something that I didn't have or that I wasn't capable of. And so I created some mental separation that blocked me from moving past that. So it's really interesting how we can either have a neutral standpoint, we could think of them highly and put them above ourselves, or we can look down on them and have some negative, look at them with negative qualities and characteristics and tie that to the money that they have. So it's really interesting how we can draw some conclusions and how those conclusions can or may be keeping us stuck from moving forward. The other thing that really has a huge impact on us is this is kind of tying back to what we talked about in the last slide, is writing down the qualities and characteristics of the rich and wealthy. And this is something that you can do as an exercise for any particular area in life. Let's say you have one individual in particular that you find to be the most triggered by or to experience the most conflict by. And you can start to look at that thought process and what's kind of guiding you into that cycle by writing down your qualities and characteristics of of the rich and wealthy and whoever that particular individual is that you might find that you're having some stress or conflict around. So is there anything that comes up for you when you think about positive or negative qualities and characteristics in regards to, in this particular situation, rich or wealthy people, people that have a lot of money? Disciplined, yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. Yeah, and this is a little bit of a reiteration and it can get into qualities and characteristics, but if we want to fine tune it, this is a great way of doing it. So, like I mentioned, that I had these beliefs that they were really smart, really intelligent. So I looked at them as those were their qualities and characteristics. There were a lot of positive attributes that I saw. And even having those positive attributes was in some way separating me from that. So that was an interesting discovery for me and having to work through that mindset around how I viewed myself in relationship to what I was trying to achieve in my goal. So this looks like just a half glass full type of analogy metaphor. And actually this was something I discovered about myself maybe a year or two ago. And it's kind of a funny story that has to do with wealth and abundance and the lack mentality that a lot of people talk about. And I remember whenever I was a child that I had three siblings and we lived in this environment where my perception of my experience was that there wasn't a lot of food, there wasn't a lot of endless resources. You know, being a kid and sharing food with your brothers, I always felt like there was some struggle to get what I wanted and having snacks at the end of the day, that kind of thing. And so I grew up in a household where I was experiencing a lot of lack. And so what's kind of funny is that I remember we had this juice that we would drink, and my parents would water down the juice to try to stretch it out and make it last. And so I remember as a small child thinking I created this strategy internally that if I only filled up my glass full of juice halfway, that mom and dad wouldn't notice that I'm having, so much of it, or I could kind of slide under the radar if I was only having a little bit every time I went to go get some instead of filling it up the whole way. And so we can kind of look back at that as an adult and think that's kind of silly and childish. And it totally is. And that's how my brain worked as a small child, trying to resolve what I saw was, um, a challenging situation. So I created some type of strategy for me to work around that. And then whenever I started being curious about my mindset and what stories I was telling myself and how I was behaving, or these types of how the evidence was showing up in my adult life, I noticed that I still was filling up my glass halfway full. It didn't matter if it was juice or some other drink or water. I always filled up my glass half full. And I had several people mention that to me over and over again, and it really never clicked until a couple of years ago. And I realized this was a strategy I had been running to preserve, to uh, kind of staying in that lack of mentality. It started whenever I was younger, and I kept that whole story throughout my whole adult life. So this is just like a silly example of how we can hold on to these strategies and things from years and years ago. And I don't need to conserve juice or ration food in my situation. So that strategy doesn't make sense in my situation. And in this particular example, it's not having a huge impact on my life that I only fill up my glass halfway full. But if we're holding on to a strategy that's really painful or really creating some discomfort in our life, there's definitely a lot of motivation in getting to the root of that. So that was a really big learning experience for me. And, obviously realizing minimal impact, not a lot of motivation to really change the behavior, but just kind of interesting. So one of the other writing exercises that I have is, are there any stories or things that you were told about money or about rich people, or um, any type of circumstances, things that you heard a lot as a child, whether that's from family or friends? I know it's pretty common um, for people to have those types of stories that kind of hang on to them. Is there anything that comes to mind when you think back about that, either good or bad? You don't have to share details, but if there's something that comes to mind for you. Yeah, my dad spent every penny. Yeah, it's really interesting observing our parents' habits. Yeah, the money you earned as a child and babysitting went to paying the bills. Yeah. So it's really, can you see, and this is like a rhetorical question, but can you see how that experience or those experiences impacted you somewhere in your adult life, whether that's in the present moment or somewhere in your past adult life, that somehow impacted the way that you did things? I can definitely say that did for me in many, many areas. Yeah. Yeah. It's just I think it's so interesting. And if you have children or if you're around children, I don't know if you've ever noticed, but this is something to think about moving forward possibly, is what am I saying, or what kind of stories am I portraying to people in my environment? What kind of stories am I passing on to my children? And that's something that I've become very mindful about is, am I portraying an attitude of gratitude and abundance and endless resources to to the future generation? Or if I am I perpetuating these same stories that I knew my parents grew up with, that they got from their parents? And where are we going to break that cycle, and does that start with us? So that's been a challenge, that I've been challenging myself with that. Another way that we can also get into some of the unconscious money beliefs or blocks that we might have is writing down our definition. And this is really a key thing, a key question that I ask people, especially whenever I'm going into a difficult topic where there might be a lot of controversy, or might be a very polarizing topic, is asking somebody what their definition is on the main terms. And that's something that's even done in, debate settings and things, because even though we have a traditional dictionary definition of these terms, what's really interesting is that people actually internally, with their own viewpoint, their own experiences, form their own definition of terms. And some of those terms that would be relevant to this workshop would be wealth, money, rich or riches, and the poor. And so the easiest way to do this, and this is kind of like something that we talk about in math, in the word is often used in math as equivalent to or equals to. So if you were to define any of these terms, if you were to say wealth is, how would you fill in the rest of that sentence? And you could do that with all of these terms. And sometimes what can happen is that people can have negative definitions or definitions around these words that aren't serving them. And one that I hear quite often, actually, and I think there could be a few different reasons I could speculate on why we form these definitions, but money is power, or money equals power is something that comes up a lot. And so power ends up being seen in a negative light sometimes, because we might feel insecure or unsafe or something else that creates maybe some stress or fear and anxiety. And so if we have unconsciously money tied to a negative experience, like we talked yesterday about different villains and characters in movies, if we've somehow associated in our mind money to some negative experience, then getting to the root of that and disconnecting and creating some space so that money can have its new definition, its own identity, and disconnect that away from the trigger and whatever we might be associating that to. And so it's kind of going back to what we've talked about in the last few days, is that we make these associations with things and we gather data throughout our life, and based off of our experiences, we continue to look to validate what we believe in. We all love to be validated. It's a part of human nature. And so we continue to validate things that don't serve us, and we also validate things that do serve us. But if we want to create positive change and pivot away from the things that don't serve us, we have to look at where we've made connections that might not make sense in our certain situation. So this is an excellent way if you wanted to dive into this, um, in your spare time, especially going into tracking your finances. That can start to stimulate some emotional responses or some beliefs that we may have about ourselves. I made this slide, or this graph. Again, I really love numbers, and I think this is really powerful. I'm a very visual person. Not everybody is a visual learner or stimulated with visual, quite the same way. But I personally love seeing the numbers. I love seeing the proof in the pudding. And so I just ran this through a calculator, and basically, I've heard a lot of people talking about this, and I kind of had to see it for myself because I think for me, it just is a little bit more impactful. That if you can just take $100, and we talked, um, let's see, yesterday a little bit through all of the days, but if we were to make even a small little change in our financial spending and our habits, can we find an extra $100 where we are maybe spending it in places that aren't really serving us or helping us reach our goal or really aren't fulfilling a purpose? If and based off of these numbers, if you were to invest $100 a month over either 10 years, 20 years, or 30 years, you can see what that looks like with compounding interest. So if you were to assume a 10% return on average, then you could see those numbers are in blue. And the amount of money, I didn't put the numbers in here, but the amount of money you invest based off of what you get in return, there's a massive difference. And this just continues to compound over time. And I understand most of us here aren't in our 20s and not starting off in the beginning. But for future generations, to teach us to our children or to other generations that we might be exposed to, and these principles, I think is just really can make a big impact in their life. And so you can also see if you were to invest $200 at that 10%, you're getting about double, close to double of what you get off of that $100. So this is an exponential return. And I find this to be really exciting and motivating personally on how just $100 can really make a big impact. And if we can work past our beliefs and these roadblocks that we put in front of ourselves that are keeping us from either earning more money to grow that or changing the habits that might be deprecating or self-sabotaging in some way. So I think this is a really powerful representation of that. So we're just going to end a little bit quickly here because we have just a small group today. But if you were to outline, we're going to get more into how do we really set a goal? What have I found to be really helpful? Um, Things that really haven't been taught, things that I wish I learned in high school and college. And these are like really, really basic principles that can really make an impact. And so where I want to start with that is just what goal would you have to set for yourself that's a reasonable goal, one that you believe that maybe is achievable, but might be pushing the envelope just a little bit. So just maybe on the verge of getting outside of your comfort zone. What do you think is a financial goal that you would like to achieve that you think is reasonably achievable? You may have a little bit of doubts about it, and that's totally fine. But if you want to make a note about what that is, and then, or if you want to take some time and think about it, we'll get into how do we put how do we set that goal appropriately so so you're set up for success in the most ideal way. And then we're going to do a fun little technique that I like to use, and I've used it to really help cement in aligning my mindset. I also use prayer on the side as part of that process, but this is just a really fun technique that I like to use to help guide my mind to looking to and keeping focused on my goals. So, do you have anything that comes to mind as far as your goal or something specific that you'd like to achieve maybe in 2025 or even later? Yeah, paying off my house. I'm with you. I am totally with you on that. I am putting a plan together and I am determined to do that. That is going to be a really exciting day, one to celebrate for sure. Okay, so awesome. So if that's your goal, so bring that back tomorrow if you're able to make it, and then we'll do a couple simple things around, what can we do to to help guide our mindset and things to achieving that. So that's where we're going to end today. And let me put a pause on here. Let me stop sharing my screen. And there we go.